The case you're about to discover will shatter everything you believed about people who disappear without a trace. This isn't just another lost hiker story. This is the account of a young married couple who ventured into the Colorado Rockies in 1993, never to return home, and a shocking 17-year investigation that exposed a chilling truth lurking in the forest shadows. What began as a routine search and rescue mission transformed into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in wilderness history, revealing that some predators don't hunt in cities, but in the silent cathedral of ancient trees where screams echo into nothingness. Stay with us through every twist, because by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why some mysteries hide in plain sight for decades. And if mysterious vanishings in America's most remote wilderness haunt your thoughts, then make sure to subscribe to Mr. Spooky and hit that like button right now. The crisp autumn of 1993 had delivered more than vibrant foliage to Colorado's San Juan Mountains. It had brought the kind of restless anticipation that drives young adventurers toward untamed horizons. The scent of spruce resin, the majesty of towering peaks, and a profound silence that exists only when civilization fades beyond the nearest ridgeline. Amanda and Christopher Brennan, both 29 years old, had recently celebrated their second wedding anniversary in Telluride and were already mapping their next expedition. They possessed modest means but boundless enthusiasm. Christopher worked as a middle school geography instructor, while Amanda freelanced as a botanical illustrator specializing in alpine wildflowers and native vegetation. They had grown weary of congratulatory dinners and obligatory family gatherings. They craved isolation and the Weminush wilderness. Sprawling, pristine, and sacred to outdoor purists represented their ideal sanctuary. They loaded their forest green 1988 Jeep Cherokee with provisions for a 6-day backcountry trek. Christopher, characteristically methodical, annotated their intended route across a detailed topographical chart and highlighted their primary destination as Crater Lake Basin, a seldom visited glacial depression in the Chicago Basin area, far removed from the crowded trails surrounding Durango ski resort zones. This location offered the possibility of establishing camp beside ancient granite formations and drawing water from crystalline streams without encountering another human soul for extended periods. They departed from their rental house in Alamosa on September 22nd, assuring Amanda's younger brother they would return by the evening of September 28th. This wasn't their inaugural wilderness experience. Christopher had completed portions of the Colorado Trail during his undergraduate years, and Amanda had been raised camping extensively with her outdoor enthusiast parents throughout the Southwest. Among their circle of friends, they were recognized not merely as individuals who could endure wilderness conditions, but who genuinely flourished within them. However, September 28 arrived and passed without contact. Then the 29th elapsed, followed by the 30th. On October 1st, Amanda's brother filed an official missing persons report with local authorities. The Brennans had vanished completely, and nobody yet comprehended that 17 full years would transpire before investigators would uncover first tangible trace of their fate hidden beneath cascading alpine water. During the morning hours of October 2nd, 1993, the La Plata County Sheriff's Office dispatched a pair of experienced deputies to the Wilderness Access Station near Vallecito Reservoir. Park Service personnel maintained no documentation of Christopher or Amanda Brennan completing entry registration, though such gaps weren't particularly unusual. The access point to that wilderness sector frequently operated without continuous staffing, and backcountry permit enforcement remained inconsistent throughout that era. Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Garrett, a veteran officer with 19 years of mountain rescue experience, assumed command of the initial response efforts. He was accompanied by Wilderness Ranger Patricia Valdez, whose intimate familiarity with the Chicago Basin terrain exceeded that of virtually any other official. They initiated their investigation by examining Christopher's annotated topographical map, which had been left behind in the Brennan apartment. The chart featured highlighter markings and handwritten notations, including water source verified, potential camp elevation, ridge scramble option, and crucially, final day, Crater Lake overlook. That final annotation immediately captured attention. The Crater Lake area represented an advanced destination, not suitable for casual recreational hikers. While undeniably spectacular, featuring thunderous seasonal waterfalls cutting through exposed granite cliff faces. The region also presented substantial risks, including treacherous boulder fields, unpredictable weather patterns, and sudden stream surges from afternoon thunderstorms. Patricia Valdez had personally witnessed numerous injuries within that specific drainage, from severe ankle fractures to dangerous hypothermia cases. Comprehensive search operations were organized with impressive speed. 2 search helicopters were deployed from Grand Junction to conduct aerial surveillance across the targeted zone. Flight crews specifically searched for the distinctive forest green color of the Cherokee or the reflective qualities of modern tent materials. They discovered nothing of significance. Volunteer teams from San Juan Search and Rescue methodically hiked established trails in coordinated pairs, broadcasting names through megaphones and carefully inspecting ravines and drainage channels. They located no established campsite, no discarded equipment, no indicators of physical confrontation, and remarkably, no forest green Jeep Cherokee parked at any documented trailhead within a 50-mile radius. On October 8th, precisely 1 week following the couple's expected return, the sheriff's office released a formal public statement to regional news outlets. We are conducting an active and ongoing search for Christopher and Amanda Brennan, last confirmed entering the Weminush Wilderness backcountry on September 22nd. We urgently request any information from hikers, campers, or area residents who may have encountered this couple. Initial tips began filtering through official channels. A convenience store employee in Bayfield believed she had observed a man matching Christopher's physical description purchasing trail provisions and topographic maps. Another witness claimed to have seen a woman with shoulder-length auburn hair and a distinctive purple backpack hiking independently near Pine River, though none of these reported sightings could be substantiated through subsequent investigation. By October 18th, the official intensive search operation was systematically scaled back. Field deputies withdrew from the backcountry zones. Helicopter assets were reassigned to other emergency priorities. The Brennan case gradually disappeared from newspaper headlines and public consciousness, becoming simply another unsolved wilderness disappearance statistic in America's vast mountain wilderness. However, the family refused to surrender hope. Amanda's brother, Marcus Holloway, maintained an exhaustive file containing everything related to the case, including ranger activity logs, meteorological data from the disappearance time frame, archived news articles, and even unsolicited tips from individuals claiming psychic impressions. Every year, without fail on September 22nd, he returned to the Vallecito trailhead carrying freshly printed missing person flyers. He consistently told wilderness rangers, "I'm not abandoning this search until somebody discovers something concrete." He possessed no conception that 17 years would elapse, accompanied by one unprecedented drought cycle and dramatic alterations in regional water flow patterns, before nature would finally surrender what it had concealed. From an external perspective, time continued its relentless march forward. By 1995, Christopher and Amanda Brennan's names had essentially faded from bulletin board postings and newspaper archives. The Alamosa Valley Courier published a brief 2-year retrospective article with the headline, "The Wilderness That Keeps Its Secrets," but public interest evaporated quickly afterward. Other tragedies, other disappearances filled media cycles. Yet for Marcus Holloway, Amanda's devoted brother, the passing years weren't measured by conventional birthdays or holiday celebrations. They were marked entirely by absence, by the aching void where his sister should have been. Every time he drove past the towering San Juan peaks visible from Highway 160, the landscape itself seemed to be withholding critical information, silent, ancient, utterly indifferent to human suffering. He maintained the lease on the Brennans' modest apartment for 3 full years, emotionally unable to relinquish that final tangible connection. In the 4th year, he finally boxed their belongings, Christopher's teaching materials and geography textbooks, Amanda's botanical sketches and watercolor supplies, her collection of pressed wildflowers. He stored everything carefully in his garage storage unit, untouched and preserved, like a memorial waiting for a future that might never arrive. Christopher's elderly parents relocated to Arizona in 1997, too grief-stricken to remain in Colorado, where every mountain vista triggered painful memories. Amanda's mother succumbed to complications from heart disease in 2000. Her father gradually stopped responding when journalists called during anniversary remembrances Hope hadn't been extinguished entirely, but it had been quietly buried beneath the accumulating weight of daily routine and the passage of relentless time. Then, during the exceptionally dry summer of 2010, Colorado experienced one of its most severe drought conditions in recorded meteorological history. Snowpack throughout the San Juan Range melted weeks ahead of normal schedules. Rivers and tributary streams that typically roar with impressive volume throughout early summer months slowed to modest trickles. Within the Chicago Basin drainage, seasonal waterfalls, including the dramatic Crater Lake Cascade, normally an impenetrable thunderous veil of white water, thinned dramatically to reveal rock faces that hadn't been visible to human eyes in living memory. A research team consisting of Dr. Michael Chun, a wildlife biologist, and his graduate assistant Jessica Ramirez were conducting field surveys tracking lynx population movements when they decided to photograph the diminished waterfall from an unusual vantage point. Dr. Chun had been conducting research throughout this wilderness for over a decade, but with water levels at historic lows, he observed exposed bedrock formations behind the waterfall that he had never previously seen fully revealed. Jessica was adjusting their camera tripod when Dr. Chun abruptly paused mid-sentence. Something had caught his trained observers eye near the waterfall's base. Initially, he assumed it represented merely a weathered fallen log wedged between massive boulders. However, as they cautiously approached for closer examination, the shape gradually became more distinct, metallic, substantially corroded, and distinctly rectangular in form. Jessica crouched low and carefully brushed away thick accumulations of moss and lichen. Her fingers made contact with severely faded forest green paint. Then they clearly identified it, a corner section of a vehicle license plate wedged tightly between stone and compacted sediment. The Colorado registration tag remained barely legible but unmistakably authentic. Dr. Chun didn't speak immediately. He simply stepped backward, his breath catching sharply as he reached for his emergency radio transmitter. Wilderness Dispatch. This is Dr. Michael Chun conducting wildlife research near Crater Lake. I believe we discovered something extremely significant, potentially related to a missing persons case. By the time wilderness rangers and sheriff's deputies reached the base of Crater Lake's waterfall system, the afternoon sun had already dropped behind the western ridgeline, casting elongated shadows across the glacial valley floor. The diminished sound of the waterfall was reduced to a gentle murmur, revealing the subtle rustling of wind through aspen groves and the distant haunting call of a great horned owl. Ranger Patricia Valdez, now serving as district supervisor and approaching retirement age, was among the first responders when the location designation Crater Lake Waterfall came through her radio transmission. She experienced something profound shift deep within her consciousness. She vividly remembered the Brennan case, the meticulously annotated topographical map, the fruitless search operations, the unanswered questions that haunted her throughout nearly 2 decades of subsequent wilderness work. As she carefully descended toward the GPS coordinates marked by Dr. Chen's research team, she consciously tried not to allow hope to override professional caution. After so many disappointing years in wilderness law enforcement, experience had taught her to temper hope with realistic expectations. What the response team ultimately discovered exceeded her most pessimistic projections. The forest green metallic structure was unmistakably a vehicle door panel, extensively corroded by 17 years of moisture exposure, but still sufficiently intact to permit identification. Nearby, caught precariously between house-sized boulders and completely covered in thick moss and lichen growth, was a twisted fragment of roof paneling painted in the identical faded forest green color. Embedded deep within the river-worn bedrock was a collapsed frame of a 1988 Jeep Cherokee, buried for over 17 years directly behind the waterfall's powerful spray. The sheer hydraulic force of seasonal water flow, year after year, had effectively hidden the wreckage from any conceivable view. However, that wasn't the extent of their discoveries. Approximately 15 meters downstream, caught securely in the exposed root system of a massive downed spruce tree, a purple nylon backpack had recently surfaced as water levels dropped. The stitching had severely frayed from prolonged exposure, but the structural straps remained surprisingly intact. Inside, protected by multiple sealed plastic bags, investigators found a water-damaged sketchbook. Despite significant blur affecting most of the ink illustrations, one image remained remarkably clear and identifiable, a detailed pencil drawing of Crater Lake's distinctive waterfall, precisely rendered from the overlooked perspective. Ranger Valdez's breath caught painfully in her throat. She immediately turned to address her assembled response team with barely controlled emotion. "Secure this entire area immediately. Nobody touches anything further until our forensic specialists arrive from Denver." That evening, news of the discovery spread rapidly throughout the interconnected Wilderness Ranger communication network. By the following morning, it had reached the La Plata County Sheriff's Office headquarters. Deputy Thomas Garrett, who had long since retired from active field duty, received an unexpected telephone call at his home. He sat in profound silence for several minutes after ending the call. Then he methodically opened a desk drawer and extracted a decades-old case file marked with two names he had never forgotten throughout his retirement years: Christopher and Amanda Brennan. By October 14, 2010, the expansive area surrounding Crater Lake Waterfall had been thoroughly cordoned off with bright yellow evidence tape and steel boundary stakes, continuously guarded by rotating teams of wilderness rangers and sheriff's deputies. State forensic analysis specialists arrived the subsequent morning with one singular mission clearly defined: determine conclusively whether the recovered wreckage and artifacts were indeed connected to the long-dormant Brennan cold case. The confirmation process didn't require extensive time. The license plate, though substantially rusted and covered in accumulated silt deposits, displayed a partially readable registration number, 7HMB49, definitively matching the Brennan's 1988 Jeep Cherokee through cross-reference Colorado DMV archival records. That single piece of evidence alone would have justified officially reopening the investigation, but subsequent discoveries sealed a connection beyond any reasonable doubt. Inside a sealed stainless steel thermos container tucked beneath the collapsed and severely corroded passenger seat structure, the forensic recovery team discovered a waterproof Ziploc bag containing undeveloped film canisters, remarkably well preserved due to the dry interior environment and multiple layers of compacted protective silt. After 2 meticulous days of specialized processing at a Denver crime laboratory, 7 images were successfully recovered from the damaged film. One photograph depicted Amanda smiling radiantly, her hiking boots partially submerged in a shallow alpine stream, towering spruce trees surrounding her like natural curtains of deep green. Another image showed Christopher crouching beside a small campfire, grinning broadly with blackened marshmallow residue visible on his thumb. The final photograph, undeniably the most haunting of all recovered images, displayed clear metadata indicating it was captured on September 25, 1993. The image provided a wide-angle shot of Crater Lake Waterfall at full autumn flow, water spraying dramatically across granite faces. And just barely visible in the immediate foreground, their dome tent nestled precariously between massive boulders, alarmingly close to the stream's rapidly flowing edge. The recovered photographic images eliminated any lingering doubt whatsoever. Christopher and Amanda had successfully reached the waterfall basin, establishing camp precisely where Christopher had marked on his planning map. However, the most critical question remained frustratingly unanswered. What catastrophic event had occurred next? No human remains had been recovered during initial site examination. No obvious signs of physical trauma. No skeletal material. No additional personal items beyond the backpack and film canisters. Geological specialists working alongside the forensic investigation team offered preliminary theoretical explanation. During late September 1993, approximately 4 days following the couple's documented arrival timeline, the San Juan Mountain region had experienced an unexpected and intense atmospheric river weather event, dramatically increasing stream volumes throughout the Chicago Basin drainage by an estimated 300% within a matter of mere hours. The sudden surge, combined with inherently unstable rock formation surrounding the waterfall base, could potentially have triggered a debris flow or catastrophic washout event, forcefully sweeping the Cherokee downstream from a temporary camping location and ultimately burying it directly behind the waterfall's powerful hydraulic curtain. If the Brennans had been inside their vehicle when the event occurred, or even positioned nearby on foot, the overwhelming force of surging water would have proven instantly deadly and utterly inescapable. However, that geological theory didn't adequately explain all observed evidence. The tent structure was never located, despite extensive downstream searches. Neither were their bodies recovered, despite deploying cadaver detection dogs throughout the drainage. When Marcus Holloway, Amanda's brother, was eventually brought to the recovery site under official escort, he stood in complete silence for over 2 full minutes before finally whispering with evident confusion, "This doesn't make sense." This wasn't their planned campsite location. Amanda would never have chosen this spot. Marcus's words seemed to echo through surrounding pine forest. This wasn't the camp. Ranger Patricia Valdez raised a questioning eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by that statement?" Marcus stepped deliberately closer to the exposed rock face where the Cherokee wreckage had been painstakingly extracted. He carefully studied the surrounding landscape features, noting the steep incline, the dangerous proximity to the waterfall system, the unstable ground visibly littered with fractured stone and perpetually slick moss coverage. This location wasn't merely unsafe from a camping perspective. He explained with growing conviction. It was completely irrational for experienced wilderness users. Amanda maintained meticulous field journals documenting every camping location. Marcus stated firmly, his voice remarkably steady despite visible emotion. She possessed extensive training in wilderness site selection protocols. She would absolutely never establish camp this dangerously close to water sources that could surge overnight without warning. She would have identified an elevated ridge location, somewhere featuring proper drainage channels and natural wind shelter. Ranger Valdez looked down thoughtfully at the investigation folder secured in her hands, specifically at the original annotated map Christopher had marked back in September 1993. The final handwritten notation remained clearly visible despite faded ink. "Final day, Crater Lake Overlook." Throughout the 17-year duration of the cold case, investigators had universally assumed this notation indicated their intended camping location. However, Marcus's expressed doubt introduced an entirely new investigative possibility. What if Crater Lake represented not their campsite destination, but rather their final planned scenic stop before beginning their scheduled exit hike back to the trailhead? The investigation team immediately expanded their search parameters, now treating the Crater Lake Basin not as a final destination point, but as a transitional location along a longer route. If the Cherokee had ultimately ended up at the waterfall base, perhaps the vehicle had been deliberately moved there, not by natural geological forces, but through intentional human action. A newly discovered detail provided substantial support for this disturbing suspicion. Forensic examination revealed that the driver's seatbelt was fastened in the buckle position, but severely twisted in an anatomically impossible configuration, strongly suggesting it may have been secured without any occupant actually seated in the driver's position. Furthermore, detailed forensic analysis of the seat track mechanisms showed absolutely no compression weight present at the time of the vehicle's final movement. In straightforward terms, substantial evidence indicated the Cherokee was completely empty of human occupants when it was moved to its final position. This forensic revelation fundamentally transformed the entire investigation. Was the couple's disappearance truly an accident resulting from natural forces? Could it have been a desperate attempt by survivors to conceal evidence of some other tragedy? Or most disturbing of all, had someone else been present in those woods during that critical week in September 1993? Comprehensive wilderness permit logs documented no other authorized backcountry users in that specific region between September 22nd and September 30th, though historical records from that era were admittedly incomplete and unreliable at best. During 1993, it wasn't remotely unusual for experienced wilderness users to venture into backcountry areas without completing formal registration procedures. If unknown individuals had crossed paths with Christopher and Amanda during their trek, official authorities would have possessed absolutely no documentation of such encounters. Then another significant development emerged from an unexpected source. A retired wilderness ranger named Gerald Morrison, who had actively patrolled the Chicago Basin trail systems throughout that particular autumn season, came forward voluntarily with a memory fragment that had troubled him intermittently for 17 years. "I distinctly encountered a solitary man up in that drainage area, probably around September 24th or possibly the 25th. He was traveling completely alone without any documentation," Morrison recalled with surprising clarity. He claimed to be camping off established trails in a dispersed location. "I didn't consider it particularly unusual at that time, but I remember he wouldn't maintain direct eye contact during our brief conversation." Morrison proceeded to describe the individual as appearing to be in his mid to late 30s, sporting an unkempt beard, wearing a faded tan canvas jacket, and exhibiting a pronounced limp affecting his left leg. The ranger had never documented the man's name in any official capacity, had never completed a formal contact report, yet he had consistently felt instinctively that something about the encounter wasn't quite right throughout the subsequent years. That seemingly minor witness statement, despite being nearly 17 years old, proved sufficient justification for the sheriff's office to formally reopen the Brennan case with an elevated classification. This time, the case would be investigated not as a wilderness accident or natural disappearance, but as a suspicious death investigation with potential criminal elements. Marcus Holloway stood at the aluminum railing overlooking the diminished waterfall and whispered almost inaudibly to himself, his words barely carrying over the sound of flowing water. They weren't alone out here. Someone else was watching them. The reopened case file, now substantially thicker with 17 years of accumulated supplementary documentation, landed prominently on the organized desk of Detective Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-minded and detail-oriented investigator with the La Plata County Sheriff's Major Crimes Unit. She wasn't inexperienced with cold case investigations, having successfully worked multiple cases that resulted in convictions despite decades of dormancy. However, this particular case presented unique challenges. It fundamentally involved the wilderness itself, vast and silent. It involved nearly 2 decades of environmental degradation of potential evidence. Most critically, it involved a vehicle that appeared to have been deliberately concealed behind a waterfall, suggesting premeditation and criminal intent rather than accidental tragedy. Detective Mitchell initiated her investigation by conducting an extensive interview with Gerald Morrison, the retired ranger whose memory had provided the crucial witness account. Despite 17 years having elapsed since the encounter, Morrison's recollection remained surprisingly detailed and specific. He wasn't simply limping in a typical manner. Morrison clarified during the recorded interview session. He was actively dragging his left leg somewhat awkwardly, almost as though it had suffered permanent injury from an old traumatic accident or perhaps a degenerative orthopedic condition. That specific detail, the characteristic dragging limp, immediately became the primary focal point of Mitchell's investigative strategy. She formally requested that the National Park Service and U.S. Forest Service compile any incident reports from September 1993 involving unidentified or unregistered hikers throughout the Weminush Wilderness region, with particular focus on the Pine River and Vallecito drainages. One historical document stood out with remarkable relevance during this archival review. A handwritten entry in a Wilderness Patrol log dated September 26, 1993, specifically referenced an unidentified male individual observed fishing illegally without proper licensing near Emerald Lake. The brief notation included only a cursory physical description written in faded pencil. White male, approximate age 35 to 40, unkempt facial hair, visible pronounced limp, declined to provide identification when requested. This represented the second documented sighting of a matching individual within the critical time frame. Detective Mitchell successfully contacted the ranger who had authored that specific patrol log entry, Raymond Tucker, now long retired and residing comfortably in New Mexico. During a recorded telephone conversation, Tucker confirmed the documented interaction with surprising clarity given the passage of time. He absolutely didn't possess any valid wilderness permits or fishing licenses. Tucker recalled firmly, when I requested information about his campsite location, he became noticeably evasive and provided a distinctly hostile look that made me uncomfortable. I specifically remember the encounter because something about his entire demeanor felt fundamentally wrong, like he genuinely didn't belong in that wilderness area, yet simultaneously didn't care whatsoever that he lacked proper authorization. Armed with these two independent witness descriptions, separated by time and location, Detective Mitchell commissioned a forensic artist to develop a composite sketch and simultaneously issued an internal law enforcement bulletin requesting any individuals with documented criminal records matching the described physical characteristics and confirmed presence throughout northern Colorado during the September 1993 timeframe. 2 potential candidate names surfaced through the systematic database search. The first candidate was rapidly eliminated from consideration after confirming he had been serving a custodial sentence in Wyoming during the entire relevant period. However, the second name, a man identified as Nathan Cross, born in 1956, possessed an extensive documented history, including multiple trespassing violations, several minor assault charges, and diagnosed mental health instability, requiring periodic interventions. Cross had been arrested in 1991 for unlawful squatting near Rocky Mountain National Park, released following psychiatric evaluation in early 1992. Critically, official records indicated absolutely no known address or documented contact after October 1993. His last confirmed location was listed as Durango, Colorado, situated merely 42 miles from the primary Weminush Wilderness access points. Nathan Cross possessed thoroughly documented left leg mobility impairment, the direct result of a severe logging accident sustained in Washington state during 1979. The potential connection remained admittedly circumstantial and legally tenuous at best, yet Detective Mitchell couldn't dismiss her investigative instincts. She obtained Cross's archive booking photograph and systematically compared it against a forensically generated composite sketch. The facial resemblance proved remarkably striking, particularly in the distinctive bone structure and deeply set eyes. However, Nathan Cross had effectively vanished from all official record-keeping systems in late 1993, shortly after the Brennan disappearance. No subsequent known residence, no death certificate on file, no traceable next-of-kin relationships, no paper trail whatsoever. This complete absence raised a profoundly chilling investigative possibility. What if not two, but potentially three individuals had disappeared into the Weminush Wilderness during that fateful week in September 1993? Detective Sarah Mitchell leaned back contemplatively in her office chair, staring intently at the faded booking photograph of Nathan Cross projected on her computer monitor, the man with the documented dragging limp. The absolute last documented trace of his existence dated to November 1993, when he received a municipal citation for aggressive panhandling in Farmington, New Mexico. Following that minor infraction, it was precisely as if he had simply evaporated into the mountain air without leaving the slightest trace. Mitchell methodically drew three names across her investigation whiteboard using different color markers: Christopher Brennan in blue, Amanda Brennan in green, Nathan Cross in red. The Brennans had vanished in late September 1993. Nathan Cross had vanished merely weeks later. The temporal and geographic proximity couldn't be responsibly ignored regardless of how circumstantial the connection appeared. The Weminush Wilderness wasn't merely scenic backcountry. It represented profoundly isolated terrain, a genuinely perfect environment to disappear completely, whether voluntarily or otherwise, or to cause someone else to disappear permanently. Mitchell arranged a follow-up interview trip to Alamosa to meet again with Marcus Holloway, Amanda's devoted brother. Do either of these names or this particular photograph mean anything significant to you? Detective Mitchell inquired carefully, methodically laying Nathan Cross's booking photo directly beside treasured photographs of Christopher and Amanda. Marcus stared at the weathered image of Nathan Cross for an extended period, his expression troubled. Then he slowly shook his head negatively. No, I don't recognize him at all. But that doesn't definitively mean anything conclusive. Amanda and Christopher were intensely private individuals, especially regarding their wilderness expeditions. They rarely, if ever, discussed random trail encounters with family members. Despite the lack of immediate recognition, Mitchell pressed forward with her investigation systematically. She conducted interviews with wilderness historians, revisited multiple retired rangers from that era, and personally visited the Crater Lake recovery site herself during optimal daylight conditions. She stood at the precise GPS coordinates where the Jeep Cherokee had been painstakingly extracted from beneath the waterfall's powerful cascade. The characteristic roar of flowing water had returned with late summer monsoon runoff, dramatically altering the acoustic environment. But Mitchell deliberately attempted to visualize the scene as it would have existed in September 1993. She mentally reconstructed the vehicle parked mere yards from the thunderous waterfall base. The conspicuous absence of any tent or camping equipment. No identifiable tracks despite soft soil conditions. No recovered human remains despite extensive searching. Then she methodically walked the established trail system backward, carefully tracing the Brennans' presumed approach path from a Vallecito trailhead access point up to the Chicago Basin drainage toward Crater Lake. Along this route reconnaissance, something unexpected captured her trained investigative eye. A narrow, barely discernible offshoot diverging from the main established trail, now completely overgrown with dense pine needle accumulation and thick underbrush that hadn't been cleared in decades. This primitive path didn't appear on any current wilderness maps or official trail registries. Driven by investigative instinct, she followed the overgrown trace for approximately 15 minutes of careful bushwhacking until it gradually widened slightly into a small natural clearing. Brilliant sunlight penetrated through the dense canopy overhead. A rough circle of deliberately placed stones strongly suggested the presence of a long-abandoned fire ring from years past. No visible trash remained scattered about, no obvious signs of violent struggle, just a profound silence characteristic of high-altitude forests. However, her finely tuned investigative instincts prickled with heightened awareness. She carefully marked the precise GPS coordinates using her handheld device and returned the following day accompanied by a complete forensic recovery team equipped with ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment. During the second comprehensive sweep of the isolated clearing, conducted with meticulous attention to detail, they discovered something of profound significance. Just below the surface layer of soft, decomposed organic material, a weathered zippered pouch gradually emerged, cracked from prolonged environmental exposure, severely weather-worn, yet still fundamentally intact despite 17 years underground. Inside the deteriorated pouch was a small spiral-bound notebook, filled with handwritten entries in tight, precise cursive script, substantially smudged from accumulated years of moisture infiltration, but still largely legible. The front cover bore only 2 words written in faded ink: Christopher's Journal. The recovered journal was immediately transferred to the forensic laboratory with extreme protective care. Despite 17 years of underground burial, the zippered pouch had performed a remarkably effective job protecting its precious contents from complete destruction. Certain ink on individual pages had bled slightly across the paper fibers, and the corners exhibited substantial warping. Yet most of the actual writing remained sufficiently legible for analysis. Detective Mitchell had the entire journal professionally scanned, meticulously cataloged page by page, and formally placed into secured evidence storage. The initial pages contained relatively unremarkable content, consisting of brief notes regarding trail conditions encountered, suitable campfire locations identified, and appreciative mentions of Amanda's botanical sketches. However, midway through the journal's chronological progression, the tone shifted dramatically and ominously. September 25, 1993. Hike steadily south-southeast toward Crater Lake drainage. Amanda's right knee still sore from yesterday's ridge scramble over loose talus. Decided to stop earlier than originally planned. Established camp near what I'm calling Spruce Bend Creek. Excellent spot overall, relatively flat terrain, good natural cover from prevailing winds. That description closely matched the approximate GPS location where the journal itself had been ultimately discovered by Mitchell's team. Critically, it was nowhere near the waterfall where their vehicle was eventually found. The campsite was located upstream, at minimum 2 full miles distant from Crater Lake proper. Subsequent journal entries chronicled a peaceful daily routine of simple wilderness living, preparing basic meals over the campfire, Amanda sketching local flora, Christopher reading selected passages aloud from a paperback novel they had brought. One page even contained a handwritten list optimistically titled, "Things to do when we get home," with mundane entries, including schedule roof inspection, develop and print film rolls, and call Marcus to confirm Thanksgiving plans. However, the final 2 journal entries sent literal chills coursing through every investigator who read them. September 27, 1993. Approximately 6:30 p.m., strange solitary man walked directly past our campsite around midday today. Didn't speak a single word to us. Just stared intensely for several uncomfortable seconds, then continued walking without any greeting. Tan canvas jacket, pronounced dragging limp on left side. Amanda felt genuinely unsettled by the encounter. I attempted to downplay her concerns and treat it casually. But honestly, something about that individual didn't feel right at all. September 28th, 1993. 7:15 a.m. Heard something distinctly alarming last night after we had turned in. Definite footsteps, circling our tent perimeter, unmistakably bipedal. Slow, deliberate scraping sound accompanying each step. Absolutely not characteristic of any animal behavior. Amanda insists we should pack up immediately and leave this area earlier than planned. I completely agree with her assessment, writing this entry very quickly before we begin breaking camp. If anyone ever discovers this journal, and we haven't returned home safely by October 2nd, something terrible went wrong out here. We saw someone we absolutely weren't supposed to see. Detective Mitchell read those haunting final words 3 separate times in profound silence, feeling the weight of their implications. There existed no further writing beyond that entry. No torn pages suggesting removal, no additional context. Just that absolutely chilling final sentence left behind, like a desperate breadcrumb for future investigators. We saw someone we absolutely weren't supposed to see. Mitchell recognized immediately that decisive action was required. She formally submitted a comprehensive case summary to the FBI's renowned behavioral analysis unit in Quantico, Virginia, presenting her developed working theory supported by accumulated evidence. 2 wilderness hikers had encountered an unknown third individual under suspicious circumstances. Days later, they disappeared without any trace. 17 years subsequently, their vehicle was discovered deliberately hidden behind a waterfall, strongly suggesting criminal intent. Perhaps, just perhaps, their killer had also subsequently disappeared, either through suicide, accidental death, or continued evasion. When the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit received Detective Mitchell's meticulously compiled case file, it certainly wasn't their initial experience assisting with wilderness-related disappearance investigations. However, what distinguished the Brennan case as particularly compelling was a discovered journal entry, representing direct documented indication of experienced fear, a specifically named threatening encounter, and a precisely established location-based timeline of events. Supervisory Special Agent Derek Chun, a highly experienced criminal profiler known extensively for previous work on cases throughout the Appalachian Trail corridor and Alaskan interior regions, was formally assigned to provide consultation. Within mere hours of thoroughly reviewing all submitted evidence materials, he placed a direct call to Detective Mitchell's office line. This behavioral pattern doesn't present characteristics of an opportunistic crime or chance. Agent Chin stated with professional certainty, if Nathan Cross is involved as suspected, he either deliberately followed your victims with premeditated intent, or alternatively stumbled upon them by coincidence, and subsequently decided they represented an unacceptable threat requiring elimination. Agent Chin focused his initial analysis on one particularly revealing behavioral detail present in the evidence: the calculated act of concealing the vehicle behind the waterfall. The Cherokee wasn't simply pushed off a convenient cliff edge. It wasn't abandoned carelessly in plain sight along a forest road. It was meticulously concealed behind a waterfall, a hiding location that required both intimate knowledge of terrain features and carefully calculated physical effort to accomplish. If this suspect pushed that vehicle behind the falls as evidence suggests, Chin continued analytically, that action wasn't driven by panic or immediate fear. It was a calculated cover-up operation requiring planning and environmental knowledge. That professional behavioral analysis triggered the next critical investigative step, authorizing a substantially deeper and more intensive search of the clearing where Christopher's journal had been buried. A specialized cadaver detection dog team was deployed from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Training Facility in Denver. It was a characteristically quiet mountain morning when the K-9 unit arrived at the site, with morning mist still hanging low and thick over surrounding trees like ethereal curtains. The highly trained detection dogs methodically worked in expanding circular search patterns, noses positioned low to ground, tails held characteristically stiff, indicating intense concentration. Approximately 23 minutes into the systematic search operation, one of the experienced detection dogs abruptly froze near the base of a narrow rocky ridge formation at the clearing's eastern perimeter. The accompanying forensic excavation team immediately began careful, methodical excavation procedures. Just beneath a relatively shallow layer of decomposed pine needles and disturbed earth, they discovered remnants of deteriorated canvas tarp material knotted tightly with degraded rope. Inside the collapsed tarp were remnants of severely decomposed clothing, including corroded metal buttons and a heavily rusted zipper pull. items visually consistent with Christopher's distinctive denim jacket, as confirmed through comparative analysis with photographs from Amanda's recovered film rolls. However, subsequent discoveries proved even more significant. Additional careful excavation revealed a fragmentary bone specimen, identified by the forensic anthropologist as a human humerus, displaying a clean fracture pattern and completely devoid of any remaining soft tissue. Then investigators uncovered another skeletal element, and ultimately, a tarnished silver necklace thoroughly tangled within the fabric remnants. The necklace was definitively identified as Amanda's based on jewelry descriptions provided by her brother Marcus. The excavation site was immediately classified as a probable burial location that had been subsequently disturbed over the intervening 17 years by natural weather erosion, seasonal wildlife activity, and the inherently shallow depth of the original interment. Sufficient skeletal material hadn't yet been recovered to permit a complete DNA profile analysis, but the combined circumstantial implications were absolutely clear to all investigators present. This remote clearing represented the location where Christopher and Amanda Brennan had died. Their deaths had resulted from accident or natural causes. They had died through application of force, violence perpetrated by another human being. The only individual ever connected to the specific area through credible eyewitness description remained Nathan Cross, the man with a distinctive dragging limp. However, Cross remained an absolute ghost in investigative terms. No fingerprints existed in any accessible database, no confirmed sightings after late 1993, no documented address, no discovered burial site or death certificate. He had simply vanished. And the most haunting question remained suspended in the mountain air. If this individual was genuinely capable of committing double homicide, where had he gone next? Had he claimed additional victims? The discovery of the shallow burial site generated significant ripples throughout both state and federal law enforcement agencies. The county medical examiner issued a preliminary victim identification based substantially on recovered clothing items and distinctive personal effects, though complete confirmation would ultimately require successful mitochondrial DNA analysis, a complex laboratory process that could require multiple weeks to complete properly. Meanwhile, Detective Mitchell aggressively pushed forward with her only substantive investigative lead, the enigmatic Nathan Cross. She personally visited the La Plata County Archives facility, methodically searching through dusty property transaction logs, archive hospital admission records, and historical land transfer documentation from the early 1990s timeframe. Buried deep within a handwritten ledger dating from 1992, she discovered something unusual that immediately captured her attention. A temporary camping permit had been issued to an individual identified only as N. Cross for an off-grid primitive campsite located just outside Bayfield, Colorado, positioned approximately 46 miles west of the Crater Lake area. According to a supplementary note in the margin, that particular primitive structure had been completely destroyed by fire in early 1994. Official cause was listed as undetermined. The registered property owner was never subsequently located for follow-up investigation. Detective Mitchell drove directly to the heavily overgrown property location that same afternoon. Very little remained of any structures, just severely charred support beams, a collapsed corrugated tin roof panel, aggressive weed growth climbing over remnants of what had apparently once been a crude front porch structure. However, as she carefully stepped to the scattered debris field, she noticed a metal lockbox, substantially blackened by fire damage but still structurally intact, wedged firmly between two fire-scorched stones beneath the collapsed stone fireplace chimney. She forcefully pried the lockbox open using a tire iron from her vehicle. Inside were numerous loose pages, heavily smudged with accumulated ash residue, yet still remarkably legible despite the damage. These weren't personal journal entries or written confessions. They were sketches, dozens upon dozens of them, all executed in pencil and charcoal. Each individual page bore human faces, some rendered realistically with careful attention to facial features, others distorted almost grotesquely. One sketch depicted a woman walking alone through a forest setting. Another portrayed a man seated beside a campfire. Additional images were considerably less distinct, merely shadowy silhouettes, unnaturally wide eyes, jagged angular teeth, all rendered in rough charcoal strokes. The disturbing part, on the back of many pages were dates, 1984, 1985, and 1986, along with what appear to be locations: Stanislaus, Cherry Creek, Hetch Ridge, and then at the very bottom of the box, a final drawing. Two figures, a man and a woman, standing beside a waterfall. Detective Monroe sat down right there in the dirt, her hand trembling as she turned the page over. In faded pencil, it read, "The Last Ones." Back at the station, Monroe and Agent Holloway reviewed the contents of the box. "It's not a confession, but it's damn close," Holloway said. "These sketches," he was watching people, maybe stalking them, maybe worse. They requested a national database sweep for Ethan Voss's name, aliases, and biometric data, cross-referencing with any missing persons in Western States post-1986. And they got a hit. In Idaho, a man going by the name Eli Vaughn was arrested in 1990 for vagrancy. No fingerprints on record. Charges dropped. The arrest photo was grainy, but Monroe knew it was him. He changed his name, moved north, and vanished again. But that moment in 1990 gave them hope. Ethan, or Eli, may still be alive, or he may be buried in another forgotten grave. Either way, the case had shifted from a disappearance to a hunt. Detective Monroe worked into the early hours of the morning. The arrest photo of Eli Vaughn pinned beside Ethan Voss's mugshot on her board. The facial structure, hairline, and eyes were nearly identical despite the 5-year gap between records. The Idaho incident, though minor, was critical. It meant Ethan Voss, or someone going by another name, had resurfaced after the Brennans' disappearance. And if he had resurfaced once, he might have done it again. Monroe contacted the Idaho Falls Police Department requesting case files and any officer reports tied to the arrest. One handwritten note stood out. Subject claimed to be living in a converted storage unit, would not disclose exact location. Cooperated during questioning, but avoided eye contact. Had a limp. It was enough. Monroe partnered with Agent Holloway and traveled to Idaho Falls, tracing the arrest location. It was a shuttered industrial lot, long since sold off. After some digging, they located the former owner, a man named Clyde Rasmussen, now retired. Clyde confirmed that he once rented a corner unit to a man with a limp and a quiet, nervous energy. Never gave me trouble. Paid cash. Moved out middle of the night in fall of '91. Said he was heading to Montana. Never saw him again. Montana. They followed the thread. A new name came up. Eli V. Hartman, listed on a library card application in Livingston, Montana in 1992. No photo, but the signature was nearly identical to the ones on Voss's earlier documents. Under the radar again. This man, if it was Ethan, had spent over a decade hiding in plain sight, moving between remote regions, avoiding digital footprints, using different names, but never abandoning the wilderness. And every time he moved, someone nearby disappeared. A retired ranger in Idaho recalled a missing camper in '89. A hiker vanished near Yellowstone in '93. And now, with this trail reopening, there was renewed urgency. Back in Colorado, the remains in the shallow grave were finally confirmed through mitochondrial DNA. Amanda Brennan. Christopher's were still inconclusive, but Marcus, now in his late 40s, received the news with quiet devastation. "I always knew they didn't just get lost," he said. "I just didn't know someone else was watching them." As Monroe reviewed everything, the timeline, the sightings, the arrests, she began preparing something rare for a case this old, a federal fugitive bulletin. After 17 years, the man suspected of murdering Christopher and Amanda Brennan was no longer just a ghost in the forest. He had a face. He had a name. And somewhere out there, he was still walking, maybe with that same dragging limp. And someone else might be next. The Federal Fugitive Bulletin for Ethan Voss, a.k.a. Eli Vaughn, a.k.a. Eli V. Hartman, was issued quietly, distributed through internal law enforcement channels and wilderness ranger offices across the western United States. The description included white male, born circa 1950, approximately 5 feet 11 inches, average build, pronounced limp on the left leg, known to frequent forested and mountainous regions, may use aliases and operate off-grid, suspected in multiple wilderness-related disappearances. Though public disclosure was withheld for now to avoid media contamination of leads, the alert yielded its first breakthrough within days. A call came from Kalispell, Montana. A woman in her late 60s named Margaret Shields said she'd seen the man the bulletin described, not once, but for an entire summer. He stayed near our Trailhead campground in the summer of '94. Said his name was Eli, kept to himself, had a bad leg, told me he was a writer. He gave me a drawing once. She still had it. Monroe and Holloway arrived at her home 2 days later. The drawing was folded into an old paperback novel, a pencil sketch of a wooded glen, detailed and serene. But in the corner, barely noticeable, was something more chilling. A human silhouette near a ridge, watching. Holloway examined the signature. It matched the ones found in the Colorado cabin sketches. "That's him," Monroe said softly. Margaret looked shaken. "There's more." He asked me questions about people, about the types who hiked alone. He said he liked solitude too, but I always felt it wasn't just about the trees. Monroe requested names of other campers that summer. Only one stood out as missing: Jonas Weaver, a 24-year-old hiker from Missoula who vanished in July of 1994. His car was found at the trailhead. No trace of him was ever recovered. Until now. His case was cold and unconnected. The FBI now had cause to believe that Ethan Voss may have been a serial predator, operating not in cities or neighborhoods, but in the remote corners of nature, where records were minimal and the silence worked in his favor. Monroe added a new section to her case board: suspected victims: Christopher Brennan, Amanda Brennan, Jonas Weaver, unconfirmed hiker, Cherry Creek 85, unconfirmed Yellowstone 93. Each name was accompanied by a photo, some faded, some fresh, but one by one, the pattern emerged. Always remote, always alone or in pairs, always in places Ethan knew better than they did. And then Monroe asked herself something that chilled her to the bone. What if he never stopped? By now. The scope of the case had shifted from solving a cold disappearance to hunting a potential serial killer who had evaded law enforcement for over 3 decades. Detective Monroe and Agent Holloway created a behavioral profile map, a timeline of known and suspected movements tied to Ethan Voss's aliases. It wasn't perfect, but it showed a disturbing pattern. 1993, Colorado, Brennan disappearance. 1989, Payette National Forest, Idaho, unidentified hiker vanishes. 1991, Idaho Falls arrest as Eli Vaughn. 1993, Yellowstone region, Montana, unsolved missing persons case. 1994, Kalispell, Montana, Margaret Shields sighting. No known activity post 1995. Had he died? Was he arrested under yet another name? Or had he simply disappeared into woods for good? Monroe feared the last answer the most. She made the decision to contact outdoor survivalist communities, wilderness forums, even YouTube channels focused on backcountry exploration. Quietly and carefully, she shared the description, not naming Ethan, but suggesting caution and seeking info on a man known as Eli, traveling solo, sketching, limping, often asking hikers about solitude. And then something unexpected happened. A user on a private survivalist forum responded. A man calling himself Ridgerun_37 posted this message. Saw a guy just like that near Bob Marshall Wilderness, Montana, summer of '09. Said he was researching patterns of human behavior in isolation. Limped, drew pictures, looked right through you. Monroe reached out immediately. They tracked the user down, a former smoke jumper named Keith Delaney, now living in Spokane. He sat across from Monroe and Holloway, his jaw set tight. He gave me the creeps, like a ghost in boots. Said he'd been out there a long time. Offered me a drawing, but I didn't take it. Just wanted to leave. Said his name was Ellis. Now you're saying he might have hurt people? Monroe nodded. We believe he has, and we're afraid he may do it again. Delaney paused, thinking, I know where I saw him. There's a ridge out near the Chinese wall. Remote even by Montana standards. No cell signal, no trails, no shelters. He was moving toward it. That location became the next target. A specialized FBI team was assembled. Wilderness search experts, trackers, forensic agents, and field medics. They weren't searching for remains anymore. They were hunting a man who had lived in the woods for 30 years, who had studied his terrain like a predator, and who had perhaps grown more elusive than ever. If he was still alive, he knew how to disappear. But this time, they knew his face. And for the first time in decades, someone was finally coming for him. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex is one of the most isolated regions in the contiguous United States, spanning over 1 million acres. Its spine is a Chinese wall, a sheer 1,000-foot limestone escarpment stretching more than 20 miles to the Montana backcountry. Few reach it, fewer stay. It was here, in the shadow of this monumental ridge, that the FBI believed Ethan Voss had retreated. The search team, 12 men and women, departed under the guise of a wildlife survey team to avoid public attention or tipping off the suspect. They carried infrared drones, silent satellite beacons, and enough supplies for 10 days in hostile terrain. Detective Monroe joined them. Agent Holloway remained behind to coordinate communication and prepare capture logistics should Voss be found. 3 days into the trek, the team split into units. Monroe's group followed the ridgeline south, keeping eyes on natural caves and ridges. It was slow, grueling work, the kind Voss himself had been used to. And then on the 4th evening, as the sun bled behind the peaks, they found a trace. Nestled beneath a dense cluster of evergreens, Monroe saw it. First, a fire ring, cold but recent. Charcoal, bits not yet bleached by sun or wind. Beside it, a tarp, lean and collapsed, but intentionally placed. And beneath it, a notebook wrapped in plastic, tied with fishing line. They brought it back to camp and unsealed it. Inside were pages of sketches again, but these were different. They weren't of landscapes. They were of people, 4 of them in particular, drawn from a distance but unmistakably detailed. A ranger, binoculars in hand, a female hiker with red braids, a man sitting alone near a creek, and Detective Linda Monroe, kneeling by the fire ring she had just found. It was drawn before she had even noticed she was being watched. One page, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, read, "Some animals chase their shadows. Others know when they're being hunted." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. He's here. He knows we're here. The search had just escalated from recovery to confrontation. Now, it wasn't a question of if they'd find Ethan Voss. It was a question of who would find whom first. The wilderness went deathly still. After finding the sketch of herself, Detective Monroe couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The realization that Ethan Voss, or whatever name he now used, had observed the team without being detected meant one thing. He was no longer hiding. He was studying them. That night, the team set up a silent perimeter, using infrared motion detectors and thermal scopes. But the forest swallowed sound, and shadows moved like whispers. Every snapped twig sent hearts pounding. At 3:47 a.m., one of the sensors triggered. Monroe was first out of her tent. The others followed, weapons ready, lights off. They followed the alert to a ridge just 200 yards from base camp. There, in the middle of the trail, stood something deliberate. A stack of rocks, a cairn crudely built, newly made. On top of it, balanced like a crown, was a ripped page from the sketchbook. It was another drawing, this time of a search team member, face covered by binoculars, rifle slung low, the date written beside it. That very day, he had been close enough to draw them again, and he'd left it as a message. "He's circling us," one agent muttered. Monroe stared at the rocks. "No, he's controlling the terrain. He knows we're here, and he's showing us that he's still in control." They took no further steps that night. Instead, Monroe proposed something different. "We won't chase him anymore. We let him come to us. We show him that the trap is already set." The next day, a decoy camp was established further down the trail, placed to appear vulnerable and unguarded. Monroe remained behind in the original location with 2 tactical agents and a drone operator stationed in a camouflage perch nearby. Hours passed. Then, just before sunset, movement flickered in the tree-line. The drone picked up a heat signature. Tall, slow-moving, leaning to one side. It stopped every few feet, always watching. Monroe and her team held their breath as the signature neared the decoy site, and then it vanished, gone mid-stride. No running, no shift, just vanished. The team swarmed the area. But there were no tracks, no fresh breaks in the branches, just the sound of wind and distant water. And one more thing, a small note pinned under a stone near the path. Written in pencil, the paper said, "I don't live in your world. You stepped into mine. Turn back. Some things aren't meant to be found." No signature, no footprints, just a warning. Monroe folded the paper silently, then turned to the team. He's not running. He's luring. And he knows this land better than anyone alive. Now, the predator wasn't just aware of their presence. He was playing with it. And now they had to ask, were they hunting Ethan Voss, or had they walked straight into his trap? Following the unnerving message and vanishing heat signature, the team's confidence began to crack. One of the younger agents, Jason Hale, requested to be pulled from the field. This guy, he's not just surviving out here. He's hunting, watching, tracking us like we're the ones trespassing. Detective Monroe didn't argue. Everyone had their limit, and this case was starting to feel less like an investigation and more like a slow descent into someone else's mind. She sent Hale back with the chopper scheduled for resupply. That night, the remaining members gathered at the fire in silence. No theories, no assumptions, just eyes scanning the dark. And that's when Monroe spoke, her voice low. He's not a ghost. He's a man. He eats. He sleeps. He gets cold. And at some point, he's gonna get tired. They needed to find his nest, his central camp, the place where he returned, rested, and studied his next move. Based on the sketches, the fire rings, and the movement patterns, they triangulated a new search radius deeper to a narrow gorge known locally as Witch's Hollow, a place hikers avoided due to steep terrain and sudden fogs that rolled in from the west. Local legend aside, Monroe was certain that's where he'd go, somewhere nobody else would. Day 8 of the search. They descended into Witch's Hollow with climbing gear and thermal drones. The area was dense, overgrown with moss-covered boulders, gnarled cedar roots, and a faint animal path that seemed to disappear the deeper they went. At the base of the hollow, tucked beneath an overhang of stone, they found it, a shelter, not a tarp, not a lean-to, a fully constructed underground dugout reinforced with timber, camouflaged with brush and deadfall, invisible from above. Inside, they found a fire pit with old scorch bones, tin cans meticulously cleaned and repurposed as tools, a water collection system using moss and stones. And most chilling of all, dozens of notebooks arranged like a library, every one of them filled with drawings, maps, journal entries, and names. Some were crossed out, others were circled. In one book, they found a list labeled "Still," and under it, 6 names. 4 verified missing persons, including Christopher and Amanda Brennan. 2 were unknown. Next to them, sketches grim, detailed, intimate. These weren't just victims. They were targets. Monroe photographed everything, hands shaking. Then, tucked between the floorboards, one final object, a locket. Inside, a photo, faded, water damaged, but recognizable. It was Amanda, smiling, alive. This was more than a hunter's lair. It was a shrine. And they weren't just close to Ethan Voss. They were standing inside his mind. The silence inside the dugout was suffocating. Detective Monroe stood in the dim space. The smell of moss and old would thicken her lungs. The locket, now sealed in an evidence bag, trembled slightly in her gloved hand. It wasn't just a trophy, she said aloud. It was personal, intimate. He kept her with him. Agent Torres, the team's forensic analyst, was crouched over a pile of charcoal sketches in the back corner. Many were smeared, damp, and rotting, but few were preserved in wax paper. One showed a woman, Amanda Brennan, not just drawn, but studied, page after page. In one, she was walking by a lake. In another, sleeping in a tent. In another still, she was drawn holding hands with Christopher, staring into the fire. They weren't just memories. They were moments he had witnessed. He lived among them, Torres murmured. He was there, watching, maybe even before they knew he existed. Monroe stepped back and surveyed the whole space. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't frantic. It was orderly, like a museum of his mind. Everything in place, documented, sorted. On the back wall, scratched faintly into the timber frame, were 3 words, the quiet ones. Outside, rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, soaking the canopy and swallowing sound. Agent Dorsey, stationed above ground, called an over radio. Movement. Ridge to the east. 30 yards. Can't get a visual. Too much fog. Monroe responded. Hold position. Do not engage unless fired upon. The team secured the dugout and ascended carefully. It was almost nightfall, and the forest had gone still again. But as they reached the top of the hollow, Torres turned and pointed. In the soft mud, a single footprint. Fresh, deep, right outside the entrance. He was here, Torres whispered. He watched us the whole time. Monroe scanned the tree-line, heart-hammering. He's not hiding anymore. He's leading us. That night at base camp, the team reviewed what they'd found. The journals revealed new names. One in particular stood out. C. Renner. A hiker reported missing in 1998 near the Absaroka Mountains, an entirely different part of Montana. The case had long been buried in a local sheriff's file. Now it was clear Renner had also crossed paths with Ethan Voss. Even more disturbing was a final entry in one of the notebooks. Sometimes I think they know, but they don't. They're loud. They forget. That's why they vanish. I stay still. Monroe didn't sleep that night. None of them did, because the truth was no longer just about Amanda and Christopher. It was about how many more had been taken, how many had never been found, and how he was still out there, walking in the dark, listening, sketching, and waiting. Years later, after Ethan Voss was finally captured in a remote cabin near the Canadian border, silent, aged, and unrepentant, Detective Monroe sat alone in her office, staring at the case file that had consumed half her career. Voss never confessed. He never explained. But in the final interview before his sentencing, he said only one thing, his voice dry and distant. They came to the woods to escape the noise. I just helped them stay. Amanda and Christopher Brennan were laid to rest together in a quiet ceremony attended by Marcus and a handful of close friends. Their names were added to a memorial plaque at the Weminush Wilderness Trailhead, alongside others who had vanished into the silence. And though justice had been served, Monroe knew the wilderness still held its secrets. Names unspoken, graves unmarked, and stories lost to the wind. If you found this mystery as haunting as we did, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Spooky, so you never miss another deep dive into the cases that the world tried to forget. Hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who believes the truth matters. And remember, some disappearances aren't accidents. They're choices made by those who lurk in the quiet places, waiting for the loud ones to wander too far from safety. Stay curious, stay cautious, and never hike alone without telling someone exactly where you're going. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also listening.